Alright, well, hello everybody, my name is Vexler, and today we are going to be talking a little bit about the build crafting in Destiny 2. This is definitely not going to be as long and drawn out of a video as some of the recent ones I've done, which include kind of a rehash of the previous 10 years of Destiny. If you've not checked that one out, please do so. Now, specifically today, I want to focus a little bit more on the build crafting. There's many different kind of elements and facets to what goes into Destiny build crafting. So what I want to do today is kind of break down some of the hurdles that have been in the game and exist in the game today. Promise it's not going to be as long. I'm not going to revisit the entire 10 years of build crafting, just kind of what the problems are today. And then I want to specifically focus and bring attention to some of the improvements and things that I believe could move Destiny build crafting in a better and more interesting direction. Now, I do want to also just preface this discussion that literally yesterday we did get a Bungie live stream which did go into detail about some of the changes to power progression as well as the portal system and how turning up difficulty is going to in turn, have better drops and whatnot. Overall, all good changes, and I think Bungie is making improvements to some of those foundation systems of the game, but I've not seen too many discussions or I guess topics around build crafting, and to be perfectly honest, I do believe that some of the things that Bungie is hitting now are probably larger problems to keep players engaged. They're kind of addressing some of the concerns that we've given them over the years. This is kind of getting a little bit more into the weeds as to some of the reasons why I don't find build crafting in Destiny interesting. So I want to go through, again, some of the major problems that I see when it comes to kind of how the game is compared to others, and then go through some of my suggestions. I'm going to do my best to not directly compare this game to other games out there, like other action RPGs. Clearly, Destiny is in its own ballpark. It's its own pretty much genre, first-person shooter, looter shooter. There's not any other game out there like Destiny. So I'm going to try my hardest to keep within just the lanes of the game and not do any direct comparisons unless absolutely necessary. With that being said, let's talk a little bit about the premise. When it comes to build crafting in Destiny, it's my personal opinion that build crafting feels pretty narrow, and although Bungie has attempted to add depth to the build crafting system through various improvements and iterations over the years, I don't believe they have hit the nail on the head yet.
Right.
So like I said, just general creativity and kind of the access that players have to tools to really tinker and make their builds varied from one another is something that I think the game desperately needs to have kind of broadened out. Now, when we break down some of the problems specifically, these are going to be problems that I guess factor into it, but I'm not going to focus a whole lot here. Itemization, so just in general, I think itemization in Destiny is something that does need some improvements, and this is a larger conversation and probably a whole video topic by itself. I do think that the target audience that Bungie has over the years kind of been not catering to, I think that possibly whoever they're making the game for could be one of the reasons that they haven't expanded or made the build variety and the amount of depth and customization you could apply to build crafting truly that deep. I also think that over the years there's been concerning, I guess, comments from the devs about the issues with the restrictiveness of the game. This is specifically referring to some of the comments that were made when Bungie had discussions about masterworking. Whenever masterwork weapons were added back in Curse of Osiris, I think there were some follow-up questions over the years about, making weapons more interesting, giving the players more mods and capabilities to change those weapons. There was some distinct conversations that Bungie gave to us in the weekly blog posts and maybe even during interviews that pretty much told us that they were kind of reaching the limit on what they could make weapons do. And by the way, this is kind of extending into armor. If you can only make weapons do a few things, you can never really expand that system. That, just from a limitation standpoint, is something that I think Bungie needs to fix. We also want to look at kind of the identity crisis that I think loot in Destiny has had. So this is specifically in reference to random rolls. Whenever Destiny 2 launched, we had random rolls taken away from us. We did get weapon random rolls back. We had the Armor 2.0 mod system that was brought in Shadowkeep. This has been iterated and changed and refreshed multiple times. Overall, is the loss of randomly rolling armor a good thing? I'm not really sure. I'll let you decide. Weapon crafting. This is definitely a big topic as well. Weapon crafting versus weapon drops. The excitement, the amount of agency that Bungie can give the player. Is that good for build crafting, bad for build crafting? I also think that bringing the emphasis back to weapon drops, this is something that Bungie has been doing recently. So again, these points are all just kind of factoring into, I think Destiny has had an identity crisis when it comes to getting randomly dropped weapons, crafting weapons, getting randomly dropped armor, crafting your armor, and I think this back and forth has led to, again, some just confusion about what the identity of loot is in Destiny and what Bungie's kind of permanent vision for loot should be. In addition to that, we also have mod systems where you can put mods on your weapon and armor. We have fragile mods that have been added over the years. We have artifact mods that have been added, taken away, and changed over the years. So overall, just Bungie's system of modding weapons and perks on weapons have been changed drastically, frequently. There's not really identity behind the weapons and what each one should do and how you should be able to customize and tinker with them. And I do think that serves into the larger problem of build crafting in Destiny doesn't feel good, but they've never really settled on a system to, I guess, build on and improve over the years. It's always been kind of shifting in rapid directions one way or the other. Additionally, when it comes to build crafting problems in Destiny, I think that a lot of builds exist in lanes, and the lanes is going to be the term that I use to describe these, and most of the time these lanes are damage type focused. And what I mean by that is if you have a build that is focused on ignitions, pretty much everything in your build is going to be solar focused. There doesn't appear to be a whole lot of synergy and cross element build crafting that is in the game. There are going to be, of course, always some niche examples. I do want to give Bungie credit that with Prismatic in the final shape, we did pretty much get the capability to expand and not really have all of our builds exist in these lanes. But I think Prismatic needs to be taken many leaps and bounds further, applied to weapons, applied to armor, applied to exotics. And if truth be told, I'm not even sure if Bungie knows what the true plans on how to expand Prismatic are. But I do think that builds exist in lanes, and they're pretty narrow by design because of that. Additionally, I think that many builds in Destiny 2 are enabled by a single exotic or a single interaction. There's not many layers of depth or kind of enhancing the effectiveness of that interaction. It's usually just binary. It's you have this exotic, the build works. You don't have this exotic, the build doesn't work. And again, exotics are often kind of served as the one niche part of the build that makes it function. Not all builds, there are some broad exotics out there that do kind of work across multiple builds, but I guess my point here is that exotics oftentimes are kind of the one major crux that makes a build work, and it doesn't always feel like there's 3 or 4 or 5 different elements that make a build feel good and kind of enhance the interactions that exotics bring to the table. That's, again, just my preference from the builds I've had over the years. If you have a different opinion, let me know. And what this kind of all boils down to is build crafting in Destiny. It pretty much is summed up and falls into 4 major pillars. We've got the subclass, which again reinforces that lane of damage that your build is kind of focus on. You've got the aspects, the fragments of your subclass, again, just kind of keeping us in that lane and maybe offering some slight leans into one way or the other. And then we've got the exotic, and those for the primary, I guess, build crafting elements in Destiny, that's what they serve as. Now, I know that through the modding system and through some of the perks on weapons, again, some of these are going to be build enabling too, but I would be willing to bet that if you were to look at a majority of the builds that exist out there on Destiny, most of the time builds are going to function or not function based on those 4 things I just named: the subclass, the aspects, the fragment, and the exotic you're on. We've got many other systems in the game other than just these. We've got weapons, weapon slots, ammo types, we've got element weapons, different types on those weapons, excuse me. We've got 5 different armor perks or armor slots. We've got armor mods, and although I will say that armor mods do help with some things like increasing the cooldown or decreasing the cooldown, giving handling bonuses, which may in turn make some builds feel better. Again, most of the time, the things that really cater and focus on a build in Destiny are those 4 things I mentioned. Now, when it comes to enhancing build crafting in Destiny, this is going to be kind of all subjective. This is just some of the thoughts that I've had. Again, I'm not trying to steal ideas from other games and other, looters out there and bring them into the game, but I do have to admit that Bungie does exist in a world where there are other third-person shooters out there. There's other loot-based games out there. So, as much as I'm trying not to pull, but some of these elements will exist under the game. So it's just the way that it works. And I do also think that there are many ways that Bungie could implement these into their game and not really make it feel alien. I think that's one of Bungie's primary things that they are worried about. If they add a core system or if they enhance a system in Destiny, I think they go to great lengths and care to never make it seem like they're just ripping it from another game. For instance, the transmog system, they called it armor synthesis. They had a complicated currency system tied behind it. Arguably, transmog system is used in many other games out there, but whenever Bungie brought it in, it was complicated, it was named different. So yeah, I'd say they'd probably go to the same lengths, kind of change and rework the way that these could be brought into Destiny if they are pretty much directly adopted from other games. Now, I am going to go through that list I just went through when it comes to build crafting and making it better. So we're going to start with itemization. Now, itemization, when I mean that itemization in Destiny is kind of bland, weapons and armor need more depth. There's many different axes that you could enhance the depth on armor and weapons. Possibly improving this with the gear tier system, which is coming with the Edge of Fate expansion. There's probably going to be a pretty in-depth video that is solely focused on enhancing itemization in Destiny and what that means and how we can really, broaden and enhance build crafting, enhance how awesome it feels to get loot in the game. But just kind of a shorter list of examples and things that, stats and things that weapons and armor should offer the player. These need to be things like damage with certain element types, void, solar, arc, area of effect, things that affect the effectiveness of your abilities, the size, the duration, how long they linger, how much they do damage for, do they do damage over time, do they do more of their damage immediately, bullet effects, so you've got the ability for bullets to ricochet, maybe a chance to deal double damage, critical hits on parts of their body that aren't precision spots, damage over time effects. So again, just a pretty broad addition of depth as far as the perks and the stats and the way that gear and armor can work, and this is just from the gear that drops. Again, itemization in Destiny, that's probably going to be a whole other video topic in itself, but I think that just for the purpose of this video, one of the things that could improve build crafting is if Bungie does take some steps and attempts over the years to really add depth to the gear in the game. And there's going to be other things in this video that kind of go hand in hand with that, but from an itemization perspective, I think that Bungie just needs to do a better job at making the weapons more interesting. That doesn't always mean making them do crazy amounts of damage, but it does mean, unlock the ability for weapons to change the way your grenades, your melee works. The same for just regular, legendary, and rare armor. Add interesting stats that affect the cooldown, not only the cooldown, but maybe how many times you can do a certain action, or if you perform the action in this way, it causes this effect. Again, itemization and the way you can change and modify your weapons, that's a whole topic we'll broach on a later day. Now, the other thing that I mentioned above is the target audience, and this is, again, specifically, I think that Bungie has, I don't really want to use the word fear, but I guess being afraid is probably the best way to describe that. I think Bungie does have kind of a concern that if they give their players too many knobs and switches to turn, that is going to in turn kind of scare away people from interacting with the gearing system and the build crafting system in Destiny. This is not me saying that all gear has to be daunting or builds have to be super, super complex, but it does feel like the game is definitely swinging in the opposite direction, where there's distrust there, or they don't feel like the players have it, essentially. So they are kind of not going in the deep end as far as making and giving us super complex scenarios and knobs and things to switch and turn on in our build. It does feel like that the kind of, I guess, the general feeling about how Bungie presents things to their players has always been more on the restrictive concern side. Now, I will say that in recent live streams, they have definitely called out to the players and the audience that they're making an attempt to get more information, such as specific stat numbers, into the players' hands. So I definitely think that maybe some of the more recent Bungie employees who've been working on some of the recent expansions, maybe they are kind of shifting back in this direction where they are interested in giving players who really want the nitty-gritty details about how things work, maybe give more of this information to them. But I think for this point specifically, just Bungie needs to be less afraid. They need to be more bold. They need to really just give players the ability to tinker and see exactly how things work. And as a result, that's going to enhance the players' ability to modify and experiment with things in the game. So For the point involving target audience, just Bungie be brave is the comment that I have to give that. Give us all the information, give us all the data. I promise that there's going to be plenty of YouTube content creators out there who break all of that information down, make it much more digestible for players, and you may come to find out that many players, more than you thought, love having that amount of information in the game to better educate themselves about decisions they make versus, some gear versus the other, etc., etc. Now, another point that I previously made as far as restrictiveness when it comes to build crafting, this is previous restrictions. This is specifically about the comments that Bungie has made in past interviews and discussions about just how complex they can make the weapon system and the armor system in the game work. Again, this is based on some comments and discussion that followed Curse of Osiris. So this is back in 2017, 2018. It is 2025. I definitely think that Bungie has made one, if not multiple engine upgrades since those discussions have been had. You can definitely drop the old generation of consoles. We're talking like PlayStation 4, Xbox One. I still think to this day that they are getting updates. Those games are capped at 30 FPS. There are probably restrictions and things that Bungie could do to enhance the amount of things that the current game can support from a complexity, from a build diversity standpoint. New hardware, we're probably going to get new consoles coming out in the next few years, as well as just taking advantage of some of the more complex power that computers have. Just optimizations, general optimizations. It's kind of not really an acceptable excuse in today's day and age to say that the game engine or the weapons and the things the players are asking for are simply just too complex for the engine to handle. If innovations are truly needed to get build crafting into a better spot and allow players and weapons and gear to have more complexity and depth, that is definitely more pushing into the argument for D3, major engine upgrades, major shifts in hardware, etc., etc. So as far as the previous restrictions, and that being a reason Bungie has maybe not perhaps furthered the amount of depth we have with build crafting, it's time to hopefully never make sure we hear that as an excuse again. All right, moving on here. This is going to be about the identity crisis. So this is specifically about how Bungie has flip-flopped on random rolls, not liking random rolls. We have got armor that is dropped that we can put mods in. We've got mods or armor to drop that we've not been able to put mods in. They've made many iterations and changes to the ways that player can kind of directly engage with the loot over the years. Weapon crafting, all that kind of falls into here. So first and foremost, I think that random gear drops, mods that you can slot into your armor and weapons, the stats, I think all of this should just be primarily drop only. Most of the loot in the game, if not all of it, that you get, can attain, and can use on your character should be something that was dropped or earned from a quest or, earned through a screen. I think that the weapon crafting system, I'm kind of skipping ahead, I think that weapon crafting, all of the craftable weapons that have been added up to this point, I just genuinely believe you should maybe move these to a legacy crafting tab or a different section of the crafting table in the Enclave, and perhaps even move the Enclave somewhere else to the tower or somewhere more, relevant in today's day and age. I think that the functionality of the weapon crafting station is something that can be enhanced and adjusted, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. But back to the original point, I think that if you see somebody wearing anything or using anything in the game, it should be random drop. All the perks on it should be random, and I think that you can then allow the player to have some agency in how to maybe change, modify, or enhance those weapons after they are basically, you got them from dropped on the ground or dropped in the world. I think that again just kind of primarily solves an identity crisis where players have to ask the question, does that drop from the world? Do I have to craft that? How do I get that? Just a generic, easy to understand concept is that anything in the world you have to go out and get it to drop or earn as a quest reward, and that just simplifies things. You don't have to kind of jump through these hoops on, well, I have to craft this, I have to find this in the world, I maybe have to do this, and that. Just from an identity crisis standpoint, everything in Destiny should be drop primarily as the source to get it. Now, when we talk about Armor 2.0, you can't really remove the quality of life that Armor 2.0 from Shadowkeep has brought into the game. I will definitely give it to you that the ability to socket mods that give direct agency and control over certain, weapon handling and weapon reload stats and armor drops, ammo drops, all of that feels pretty good. I don't think that you can take a system as monumental in that and just remove it from the game. But I do think perhaps that you can combine and enhance that system to basically work with a random drop system, where a majority of the impactful perks, or maybe just brand new perks, drop on the armor that drops on the ground, and then players can still slot a curated selection of mods, a very similar function to how the ones work today, with specific focuses on ammo, weapon handling, weapon reload, regeneration for abilities, and, stat bump focused mods. I think that there is a world where primarily most of the power that does come from armor that drops in the open world is on kind of random perks and random stats that drop on that armor, but I do think that you can keep the current Armor 2.0 system in place to where you can slot some of those maybe minor mods that focus on weapon handling, weapon reloading, and just maybe just the same exact perks that drop on gear, just to a lesser effect. So I do think that Armor 2.0, from a implementation standpoint, it was awesome, quality of life out the ass, but I think that, again, with my original point, moving most of the gear into the game back to a kind of a drop only system and giving the player some smaller agency about putting mods into it, I think is going to be a better idea for grind, a better idea for build agency. And not to mention, anytime that you have randomly rolling gear in a game, you've got perks and stats that randomly roll, it does give you the capability to make those in turn stronger. Because if you allow any player in the game to socket the mod that gives you X damage increase with something specific, you can't necessarily make that mod crazy broken, because again, everybody has access to it. Everybody can put that in the armor at any time they want to. If you want to add things into the game that are maybe more impactful, more exciting to get, that really make players go, wow, how did you get that? How is that piece of armor so strong? It has to be something that is earned or dropped in the world. It can't be something that a player just sockets into it. Now, I think there is an exception maybe later on in the video when I talk about the player mods, the player crafting that you can do, but for the most part, some of those super powerful drops or super powerful things in the game, like perks on armor, stats on armor, should be drop only, and that kind of brings excitement and kind of an emphasis back on exciting drops in Destiny again. Now, back to weapon crafting. I did mention a few moments ago that I think the overall plan and idea behind weapon crafting many years ago was good. This was back when sunsetting was pretty much going to be happening in the game, so weapon crafting was probably going to be there as a pressure release valve to give players the ability to kind of recraft things and solve problems from sunsetting being in the game. But now that sunsetting's gone and weapons last forever, they can be infused forever, I don't know if there's really a need for weapon crafting in the game currently. That being said, all of the weapons that currently have been attained and unlocked in weapon crafting, my suggestion for Bungie would simply be to move all of these recipes to kind of a legacy tab in the Enclave station. I do think that crafting in Destiny does have a place, but I think instead what you should kind of rebrand that to is gear tuning or gear crafting instead of just weapon crafting. Moving forward, you bring a piece of gear that you've got to drop in the world and you bring it here to enhance it, to upgrade the perks and upgrade the stats on it, or to even slot in your own drop mods that you've earned in the world. So you may, for instance, have common mods, rare mods, legendary drops, legendary mods, exotic mods that you can actually socket into these weapons, and that is kind of done through the gear tuning or the gear crafting station, which is kind of what the evolution of weapon crafting becomes. And I just simply think that that's a better way for weapon crafting to exist in Destiny, instead of being able to come to this station and craft, everything in the game. Arguably, I think that the primary source of drops and power in the game should be exactly from RNG drops. And I think that you can bring weapons here, bring armor here to really focus and kind of attune and specifically drive or move that piece of gear in a direction to enhance it. All right, so another thing when it comes to kind of the identity crisis with Destiny is bringing excitement, strong perks, and just general excitement back to build crafting. So I've already mentioned several points up to this time where we're talking about random rolls happening, bringing an emphasis back to random rolls, bringing an emphasis back to random rolls in respect to gear. And this is just kind of another reminder, a rehashing of this point that I made earlier. If Bungie does bring an emphasis away from crafting back to random rolls, it does give them the ability to add more kind of broken or stronger perks when it comes to weapons, when it comes to armor. And this is, again, just a refresher point that I think that there is a world where Bungie can put lots of crazy perks and things on weapons and armor, but it does have to exist in a world where those are random rolled, those are hard to get, those are rare to find. But I do think from a build crafting standpoint, build crafting to be exciting, you have to have things that really make your weapons and armor feel impactful. Crazy high stat rolls and stat drops that can drop and exist on armor and weapons. I think those are good for a game. They're exciting for the game. There's always a chance to get something super exciting or a weapon that just outperforms all your other weapons because of that being the case. So again, I think just Bungie needs to do another revisit on random rolls, on how awesome they can be, an expansion of depth that all kind of ties back into itemization we talked about earlier. But yeah, itemization and random rolls, that's where the true excitement of Destiny exists. Now, another point that I'm making here is that the mods specifically, so we've already talked about how in present day Destiny, there are a selection of mods that you can put into a weapon, and then there also are a selection of mods because of the Armor 2.0 system that you can directly socket into armor. What I believe is that the weapon mods specifically, and the armor mods for that matter, I think they need a facelift. I think they need to be more exciting, more impactful, and I think that Bungie could possibly shake up the formula because of how strong they could make these. So for instance, there was a time in Destiny, and anybody if you play Destiny 2 Vanilla will remember this, there was a time in Destiny where shaders, the ability to alter the cosmetic colors and appearance of armor and gear, those were actually dropped in the world and they were consumable. I foresee a possible world in Destiny where many of the perks and the crazy stat bumps and just the things that really make your armor and weapons really flashy and awesome, I think there's a world where many of these things could drop as actual perks, as lootable items in the open world, in quests, in strikes, in raids. And these are actual items that you can socket into your armor, into your weapons that drastically affect or alter the performance of it. And this hopefully could be tied in directly to how the mod system works in Destiny today. I believe that if Bungie wanted to do so, they could make these crazy broken, and they could also make them consumable, similar to how the old shaders worked in Destiny 2 Year 1. However, if they didn't want to make them consumable, they made it to make it where if you basically got the drop, you could use it as many times as you want to. That makes sense as well. But I do think that they could make really crazy ones where they're basically one-time use. But I'm thinking of things that are right out of the box here. You know, we're talking weapon mods that allow you to change the element damage type of the weapon. And if you play Destiny 2 Year 1, this was actually the only thing you could do on weapons, is you did have the ability to alter or change the weapon element. I think that there should be weapon mods out there that allow you to change the fire mode. You know, this is be something like cycling between full auto, burst, pulse, or scout rifle mode, or maybe even just increasing or decreasing the fire rate while also having an effect on the impact. I think that many of the older perks that have existed in Destiny, this is things like Kill Clip, Rampage, Zen Moment, I think these could be created as mods, or, you know, maybe a weakened version or a stronger version could be created as a rare mod that drops in the world, and you essentially have the ability to socket these on any weapon you want to in the game. I think that's also a cool and awesome idea. Weapon adjustments, so things that drop randomly on weapons such as barrels, perks, scopes. This could also be something that's expanded on in the armor weapons or the mod system. So let's say a weapon drops for you, it dropped with all kinds of cool magazines and scopes, but the one you wanted specifically isn't on there. It's got other good perks. Well, because of the weapon mod system, you'd actually be able to put the exact one on there. Maybe you've got a rare version or a legendary version of that same scope that gives you other benefits like reload speed or, you know, range stat, etc., etc. So there's definitely, I think, rooms to flesh out the weapon mod system. And again, I think you could have a world of Destiny where those are dropped. Those are lootable items. You find them, you can put them in weapons and armor, maybe even make them consumable so they have more of a value, maybe even make them tradable. Who knows? I think there's lots of ways you could do that with the weapon and armor system. Now, specifically with the armor mods and gear mods, I think that the current Armor 2.0 mods, this is a lot of things that focus on like the weapon handling, the reload stat, the ammo drops. I think these could be kept and maintained. I also think that we should add some new ones, things that alter or have interactions between subclass verbs. So this would be things like maybe a special mod that you could put in your gloves. It's a rare mod or a legendary mod or maybe an exotic mod that you can put on your gloves or your boots that does something like anytime you shatter a stasis crystal using an arc weapon or arc damage, that stasis shatter effect applies jolt. Or maybe you could have a mod that you place onto your chest piece that makes it so that anytime you suspend an enemy, they are weakened. You know, these are the kinds of build enabling things that normally only exist on exotics or maybe in the subclass and fragment menu. And I really think that Bungie basically taking a lot of these kind of build defining or build altering effects and putting it on mods and different things that we as the players would have to put around on armor and even in weapons. I think that's the primary focus behind this point here, is that the mod system needs a facelift. We need new exciting mods, we need powerful mods, and if you want to make them consumable and vice versa, make them more powerful, that's an avenue and something I think you should experiment with. Another point that I made earlier when it comes to the staleness of build crafting, and this is probably one of the largest, if not the largest point, is Bungie needs to make an attempt to decouple the builds from the elemental lanes. So I think that build variety and build depth when it comes to Destiny, just from my personal experience and my subjective opinion, is that oftentimes build just fall into these elemental lanes because of the way that the different verbs work, and that's just kind of the way that Destiny has operated for a long time. I think that there should be some attempts, and I'm going to list a few ways they could accomplish this, to essentially decouple or allow builds to exist that kind of exist in multiple subclasses, or allow different subclass interactions to exist. I gave an example earlier where like mods that you could put into your armor would have interactions between stasis effects and arc effects, or the effects of strand with weaken. So different effects like this I think should be embraced and made available to the player. I think that the gear mods suggestion I made earlier is one of the caveats in that. I think that what Bungie has done with Prismatic when it comes to having the fragments and the aspects kind of directly tie just into light and darkness abilities versus specific elemental abilities, this is a good step in the right direction. I think that there needs to be interactions both in the subclass system, the gear mod system, that could coexist. So for instance, you could have ignition effects that are stronger, larger AoE, larger shatter effects. I think that if you have multiple of these subclass verbs working in the same build, they have compounding effects. So for instance, if you have ignite or scorch effects that are interacting with shatter or chill effects, they could interact and maybe even counter one another, or vice versa. You might have an example I gave earlier where shattering effects and electrify effects from Jolt complement each other. I think if you had a lot of these different interactions between verbs, it would make build crafting kind of interesting, and these could all be enhanced through exotic capabilities. And, you know, for instance, if you had an interaction between, you know, shatter and jolt, an exotic out there makes it so that it also does an ignition at the same time, and all of a sudden you've got multiple avenues, multiple subclasses talking to each other, multiple ways to make an interaction like that interesting and work on many different builds. I also think as far as decoupling builds from elemental lanes, Bungie just needs to add more kind of damageable types into the game that don't really fall into any of these categories. This is a world we've got, you know, kinetic damage, we've got like 6 different element types, but what about things like bleeding, you know, have damage over time effects with like the kinetic based damage type. You can also have like corrosive effects like poison that burn away, you know, shields or armor systems in the game. Enemy destruction, this is something that you see often with like the Vex, where you can shoot portions of their body off, and then they of course can't shoot their gun, or they maybe are moving slow. Maybe kind of an investment opportunity to where we can crowd control enemies. You know, stasis and strand, I would say, probably already does this to a large degree, but that's again coupling the crowd effect and crowd controls to those subclasses. You add different crowd control effects for us that interact with our weapons, interact with our abilities, interact with the mods we can put on armor, just for, again, greater build control and variety of adding crowd control. If I wanted to add something like armor and damage resistance to a build that was focused on jolting, and this is a build that I did during the End of the Light, where I was using Arc Warlock, It was really, really awesome at crowd control and just dealing large amounts of jolt damage and AoE damage with the arc subclass. But if I wanted to maybe perhaps do some investments in tankiness or health regeneration at that time, pretty much everything I had existed in that arc lane. I had to do things with ionic traces, I had to do things with jolt, I had to do things with arc blinding effects. If I wanted to kind of incorporate things like the solar cure, the solar regeneration effect, if I wanted to incorporate things like weaken, if I wanted to incorporate things like frost armor, it's much harder, if not impossible, to do that because there's not many build enabling things or building mods that allow us to do that. There may be one exotic out there that, again, allows one of those many interactions I just named work, but I think that Bungie should do a better job and enhance and add many things that do allow us. Like, imagine if you could do the build that I just described where everything's being jolted, I'm throwing arc grenades out whenever I land, you know, a jolting effect on 3 more targets. I get frost armor, and while I have frost armor, any of the damage that I deal that jolts enemies also like weakens them or does some kind of scorch effect. Again, this get me on a, you know, spider web of ideas if we simply just had these kind of tools available to us. So I think that, again, the introducing many non-elemental focuses like bleeding, corrosive, giving us enhanced abilities to crowd control enemies, and then also giving us the ability to have many different more cross-class, compatible mods and systems and interactions in the game would be beneficial. Another thing that I want to talk about when it comes to kind of separating build effectiveness and kind of build identity with these subclasses is I think that Bungie should really invest in having basically scalars or effectiveness of certain things in the game. For instance, ignitions, shatters, suspensions, weakens, many perks in the game like Kill Clip, Outlaw, Incandescent. Oftentimes there's one, maybe just 2 versions of these. Like, for instance, all of our weapon perks that exist out there, there's really just one that exists, and then you have an adept version that offers some slight bonuses. Same goes for subclass verbs. You know, Scorch is Scorch, ignitions are ignitions, Jolt is Jolt. Again, you might have some small perks or exotics that increase these slightly, but what I'd like to see Bungie do is actually offer high degrees of scale, being able to scale these up. So for instance, you could have on many of the fragments or the aspects or the class items, whenever it says Jolt or Weaken, you could have a tier assigned to that. So for instance, Weaken tier 1 would provide a 15% debuff, and then Weaken tier 3 would either increase that debuff to 20% or maybe make it last longer. I think that one of the problems plaguing Destiny is that a lot of the builds are binary, and what I mean by that is it's either doing what it's supposed to or it's not doing what it's supposed to. The build is enabled or the build is disabled, and I don't think there's many levers, switches, and things we can do as players to increase how effective that build is. So for instance, if you are building let's just take the build I made earlier, where if you're building a Warlock that is throwing out arc grenades and jolting like crazy, once you've achieved basically the ability to get your grenade back really quickly, and you've got like the best weapons for doing it, that's about as much as you could scale. You don't have the ability to increase the number of targets that your jolt affects. You don't have the ability to increase the damage of your jolt. You don't have the ability to increase the effectiveness of your blind, how long your arc blind lasts for, the area of effect of your arc blind. Happened to be at the time it was the only rocket sidearm assisted frame in the game. You know, it'd be nice if I had on that particular weapon Kill Clip tier 3 instead of Kill Clip tier 1, or I think it might have even had a perk where I was getting Jolt Shot, Volt Shot, excuse me. Imagine if I had Volt Shot tier 5 where it chained to a lot more enemies, it did a lot more damage instead of a Volt Shot tier 1. I think that many of the perks, the verbs, the build enabling exotics in the game, I think they could take in maybe even just a page from other looter-based games out there, have these roles of these perks, of these verbs, of these stats that increase or decrease the effectiveness of them, and that does kind of drive more of a loot chase. It incentivizes players to chase those higher tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 loot pieces, because those have a tendency to roll with tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 of their perks and their verbs. So I do think that Bungie should also take a look at the investment, the engagement chance of players being able to basically get stronger perks, get stronger verbs, get stronger interactions between their weapons, etc. All right, Well, build crafting revised. So earlier I made a comment about kind of the different elements that make building a build in Destiny. Today, just as a refresher on that, the primary avenues that you have to create a build and really tune and customize that is done through the subclass, the aspects of that subclass, the fragments of that subclass, and the exotic. And again, just from my personal opinion, most of these things you're turning on and off are exactly that. They're just either enabling the build to work or they're not enabling it to work. There's not a huge degree from my experience in the ability to scale how effective a build is once you've got it turned on. Oftentimes it's just making it work or not making it work. What I'd like to see in Destiny 2, possibly through some of the suggestions and the examples I've given, is a revised build crafting system that utilizes those pillars I've named: the subclasses, the aspects, the fragments, and the exotics. But I do think that there are many different rooms for improvement for the random perks on the armor, as well as the crafted perks that you can put on the armor. So again, I talked about how I think the mods that are in the game should be enhanced, improved. I think that you should be able to socket these rare mods, legendary mods, exotic mods that give crazy benefits into the armor itself. I think the same thing goes for weapons. The weapons that drop need to have random rolls. The perks that roll on those weapons could be exciting. They could be different tiers and effectiveness. You've also got craftable perks that you could directly slot into these weapons that drop in the world, same as armor. You have rare mods, legendary mods, exotic mods. I also think that there's many different rooms for improvement as far as the stats that drop on weapons and armor, different things that increase, the damage with certain elements, things that increase the size of abilities, like your grenade area of effect, things that increase the effects of some of the subclass verbs you have working. So for instance, you have maybe a mod or a stat on your gloves that increases how long enemies are weakened by you anytime that you apply a weaken. And lastly, I think there's a real advantage and thing that Bungie could take advantage of adding verb compatibility. For instance, anytime you ignite, there should be an effect on weakened targets. If you have spliced targets, they should interact with shattered targets. So many of the subclass verbs in Destiny, I think, don't really have a lot of talking to each other capabilities. And I think that if Bungie does add many perks, weapons, and mod systems to the game that allow those to kind of talk to one another, that's really well received. Some build crafting, just truly change. Because again, I think for the most part, from Destiny today, a lot of the problems when it comes to build crafting feeling stale, shallow, having no depth is many of the build crafting things we have exist in lanes. They're binary, either they're on or off, and there's no real depth. There's no real ability to scale how strong a build is into the end game. It's usually just working or not working. And I think that through some of the suggestions and comments I've made here, Bungie might have the advantage of being able to incorporate these, add depth to the systems that are already in place, and hopefully put build crafting into a better spot that drives further engagement from players like me who really want to feel like their time and the ability to invest in certain avenues of the game is there and present whenever I log into play. I did have kind of an example build that I wanted to kind of go through as far as comparing it in the current system to how it could look in the new system that I've described, but just based on the duration of video, I'll probably just throw it in the chat, or throw it in the description, I should say. So if you have any comments, questions, opinions of your own, if you think any of the suggestions that I've made here are stupid, you think Bungie couldn't do them, or you think that you personally would hate them as well, let me know. Leave a comment. I'd be interested to get your take. Are you happy with the amount of build variety and build depth that's in the game? Do you think that the suggestions I've made would hurt, would make it better? Anything you got, I'd love to hear it. Either way, I will check you out in the next one. Thanks.